Everyone feared the Duke's massive wolfhound. It followed the quiet maid like a gentle shadow, revealing a hidden bond. County Wexford, Ireland, 1887. The first thing anyone noticed about Coo More was his size. He stood at the shoulder of a grown man. His paws were wider than a woman's hand spread flat. His coat was the color of ash after a fire goes cold, gray and pale and heavy, and his eyes were a strange amber that caught the light in a way that made people feel they were being studied rather than seen. When he walked through the long stone corridors of Ashgrove Hall, his nails clicked against the floor in a rhythm that everyone in the house had learned to listen for. The sound meant, "Move aside." The sound meant, "Do not be here." The servants at Ashgrove Hall were not cowardly people. Mrs. Follen, the housekeeper, had managed a household of 22 staff for 11 years without flinching at anything. Patrick Brennan, the second footman, was a strong young man from Galway who had grown up on a working farm. The cook, a woman named Agnes, had once chased a thieving fox across 3 fields in the dark without stopping. These were practical, experienced people. And yet all of them, everyone, stepped out of the corridor and pressed themselves flat against the wall when they heard those nails on the stone floor. No one had been badly hurt. That was the truth. But the dog had growled at the head footman once, a deep and serious sound that the footman said he felt in his chest rather than heard with his ears. He had stood completely still for 2 minutes before daring to move. And once, early in the spring, Coo More had placed himself between the door and the Duke's visiting nephew in a way that was not aggressive exactly, but was so completely certain and so large that the nephew had simply gone another way and told no one about it for a week. The Duke himself, Edmund Blackthorne, 52 years old, widowed 3 winters past, a tall and quiet man with little patience for conversation, seemed unbothered by all of this. He walked with Coo More every evening along the south path of the estate, the great dog at his left side, and he came back looking no different than when he left. He never explained the dog to anyone. He had owned him since the dog was a puppy, 8 weeks old and small enough to carry in 2 hands, and whatever agreement existed between them was not something Edmund Blackthorne saw any reason to explain to his household. So the staff managed. They learned the dog's schedule. They learned which rooms he used and at what hours. They left space. They did not make quick movements. They did not stare. And if a new person arrived at Ashgrove Hall for the first time and did not yet know these rules, someone would pull them aside within the first hour and explain. This is what happened when Nora Sweeney arrived in October of 1887. She came by cart from the village, carrying a single trunk and a small cloth bag that she held on her lap the whole way. She was 23 years old, brown-haired, not tall, with ink-stained fingers and a calm face that most people read as shyness but was, in fact, simply quiet attention. She had grown up on a sheep farm in County Clare as the 5th of 7 children, and she had learned from a very young age that the world ran more smoothly when you watched it carefully before you spoke. Mrs. Follen met her at the back entrance, looked her over with the direct and unhurried gaze of a woman who had interviewed hundreds of maids, and said 3 things. First, that she would be assigned to the general cleaning of the east wing and the common corridors. Second, that meals were at 6 in the morning and 7 in the evening. And third, and here Mrs. Follen's voice changed slightly, not softer exactly but more careful, that the Duke's dog had the run of the house, and that Nora should take great care. Nora asked what kind of dog. Mrs. Follen told her, an Irish wolfhound, very large, not friendly. Nora nodded and said she understood. She did not seem afraid, which Mrs. Follen noted privately and said nothing about. For the first 2 days, Nora did not encounter the dog at all. She learned the layout of the hall where the cleaning supplies were kept, which floors needed extra care, which windows stuck. She was thorough and quiet and did not talk much, which Mrs. Follen appreciated. On the 3rd day, she was assigned to the East Wing corridor, the long, cold passage that ran along the north side of the house, with tall windows and a stone floor, and at the far end, a wide alcove where Coo Moore slept on a folded wool blanket when the Duke was away. The other maids told her quickly, "Do not make sudden movements. Do not look him in the eye. Do not speak to him. Do your work and come out." Nora listened to all of this and nodded. She picked up her bucket and her cloth and went in. What she did next was not something she had planned. She had simply noticed before she even reached the alcove that the dog was already awake. His head was up. He had heard her come in. His amber eyes were watching her across the length of the corridor, with that steady, studying expression she had been warned about. Nora looked at him. She did not look away quickly, which was what most people did. She did not freeze either. She simply looked, the way she had always looked at animals on the farm, not challenging, not frightened, just present. She took him in. The size of him, the gray heaviness of his coat, the way his ears were forward but not flat, the way his body was still but not coiled. Then she did something that no one who worked at Ashgrove Hall had ever done. She sat down on the floor. Not next to him, not reaching toward him. She simply lowered herself to the cold stone floor about 12 feet away, put her cloth in her lap and began to hum. It was a low, soft, wandering sound, a tune her father had used on the farm when the dogs were restless, something without words, more like breath than music. Coo Moore stared at her. He did not growl. Nora hummed for a while, and then she began to clean the floor near her, working slowly and without fuss, not moving toward him, not moving away. After some minutes she looked up and found that the dog had set his head back down on the blanket, though his eyes were still open and watching her hands. She finished her section of the corridor that morning and left without incident. The next morning she came back, and the morning after that. By the end of the second week, Coo Moore was no longer watching her from across the corridor. He was watching her from 6 feet away. By the end of the third week, he had moved his blanket. No one saw this happen. They only noticed one morning that the blanket was closer to the corridor door, closer to where Nora began her cleaning each day, and that the dog was lying on it with his chin on his front paws and a look of complete ease that none of them had ever seen on his face before. Patrick Brennan was the first to say something out loud. He said it to Agnes in the kitchen, half laughing, a little unsettled. "The dog has chosen the new maid." Agnes did not laugh. She refilled her kettle and said, "Well, the dog has better taste than most people she knew," and that was the end of the conversation. Mrs. Follen watched more carefully. She noticed that the East Wing corridor was now the most thoroughly cleaned passage in the entire house, because Nora was the only one willing to go in without dreading it, and she took her time. She noticed that on mornings when Nora was assigned elsewhere, Coo Moore could be found waiting near the corridor door in a way that was not quite waiting but was not quite anything else either. She noticed that the dog, who had always eaten alone and quickly, had begun to eat more slowly on the mornings when Nora passed through the kitchen. Mrs. Follen was a practical woman. She rearranged the cleaning schedule so that Nora passed through the kitchen most mornings. Nobody asked why. Everyone understood. What the household was watching, though none of them used this word for it, was trust being built. Not all at once, not through any grand gesture, but piece by piece, day by day, the way real trust is always built, between people or between a person and an animal, through showing up and being the same each time and not asking for more than was offered. Nora never pushed. She never tried to pet the dog before he was ready. She never called him to her or made a fuss when he came close. She simply continued to be what she was, a quiet, steady presence who moved without startling things, and she let Coo Moore decide what he wanted to do with that. What he decided in the end was to stay near her. By November, he walked with her through the corridors in the mornings. Not at her heels exactly, but alongside, his great shoulder at the level of her waist, his pace matched to hers, his attention moving the way her attention moved. When she stopped, he stopped. When she turned, he turned. The other staff watched this from doorways and said very little, because there was something about the sight of it, this enormous, feared animal moving so gently beside this small, quiet woman, that made speech feel unnecessary. The dog did not do this for anyone else. Not for Mrs. Fallen, who had been at Ashgrove 11 years. Not for the Duke's nephew, who visited monthly and tried, once, to pat Coomore on the head and received such a direct and unamused stare that he withdrew his hand immediately. Not even truly for the Duke, who the dog obeyed and respected, and had walked beside for 6 years, but with whom there was a different quality. With the Duke, Coomore was loyal. With Nora, he was simply comfortable in the deep and uncomplicated way that animals are comfortable when they have decided that someone is safe. Edmund Blackthorne saw it himself on a gray morning in October, almost a full year after Nora had arrived. He had come in through the back gate after his morning ride and was crossing the lower garden when he stopped. In the narrow path between the rose beds, bare now, all thorns and dark stems, his wolfhound was sitting properly, not lying down, in the way he sat when something had his full attention. Beside him, on the low stone bench, sat a young woman reading a letter. Her head was bent over the page. One of her hands rested lightly on the dog's ear, not stroking, just resting there, the way you might rest your hand on something that belongs to you, or something that has quietly decided it belongs to you. Coomore's great head was leaning very slightly toward her hand. The Duke stood at the gate for a long moment. He had never, in 6 years, seen the dog lean toward anyone. He went back into the house without speaking. That evening he asked Mrs. Fallen with a casualness that did not quite convince her who the young woman in the garden had been. Mrs. Fallen told him, Nora Sweeney from County Clare, here just over a year, very reliable, good with the dog. The Duke listened, nodded once and said nothing further. But the following Monday, without explanation, Nora Sweeney was reassigned from the general cleaning rotation to the care of the Duke's private library. It was a quiet room, lined floor to ceiling with books, and it required attention and steadiness rather than speed. It was also a considerable step up for a junior maid. No one questioned the decision out loud. The library had a window that looked into the rose garden. When the other staff asked Nora over time what she had done with the dog, how she had managed it, what her secret was, she gave them answers that were true but that they found unsatisfying. She had moved slowly. She had not pretended to feel something she did not feel. She had spoken to him, in Irish, the soft Western dialect she had grown up with, as though continuing a conversation that had no particular need to go anywhere. But there was something else, something she did not say in those first months because she was not sure anyone would understand it. On that very first morning, when she had sat down on the cold floor of the East Wing corridor and looked across at this great gray dog that the entire household feared, she had not seen what they saw. She had not seen a dangerous animal, a territorial creature, something to be managed or avoided. She had seen a dog who was very large and very much, and who had perhaps never had anyone sit quietly near him without wanting something from him. She had seen, in other words, loneliness. Not the loud, asking kind, the quiet kind, the kind that does not know what to do with itself and so becomes very still and very watchful and is sometimes mistaken for something harder than it is. She had recognized it because she had felt it herself, on the farm in a large family surrounded by people and still sometimes apart from all of them. She knew what it looked like in a living creature, and she had thought, well, I will just sit here then. I am not in a hurry, I am not afraid, and if he wants company he can come and have it. He had come. That was the whole of it. Nora Sweeney remained at Ashgrove Hall for 11 years. She rose, in time, to the position of head housekeeper, a remarkable thing for a woman who had arrived with one trunk and ink-stained fingers. She was known for running a calm house. She was known for being fair. She was known, particularly, for the way the animals on the estate behaved around her, the horses standing quietly at her approach, the yard dog settling when she passed. Koo Moore died in the winter of 1893 at the age of 12. He was found in the morning, lying in the corridor outside the housekeeper's room, peaceful and still. The staff told the Duke together, gathered in the hallway, none of them quite willing to say it first. The Duke buried him in the rose garden, in the narrow path between the beds. He did not explain why he chose that spot. The ones who had been at Ashgrove long enough did not need him to. Years later, when the local parish gathered accounts of life at the great houses of the county, Patrick Brennan, by then an old man with a long memory, sat with the interviewer and thought for a while before he spoke. He said that in all his years at Ashgrove Hall, the thing he remembered most clearly was not the Duke, who was a serious and private man, and not the grand rooms, which were cold in winter and difficult to heat. What he remembered was a quiet young woman walking through the morning corridors with a great gray dog at her side, both of them perfectly at ease, neither of them asking anything of the other. He said it had been, somehow, the most peaceful thing he had ever seen. He could not explain why. He tried a few times in the years after to put the feeling into words. He talked about it with his wife one evening over supper, and she had listened carefully the way she always did, and then she had said, "Perhaps it is because kindness is easy to overlook when it is quiet." He had thought about that for a long time afterward. He thought she was probably right. There was a particular morning he returned to often in his memory. It was early spring, cold still, frost on the inside of the kitchen windows before Agnes had the stove going properly. He had been sent to carry a message to the East Wing, and he had come around the corner of the corridor and stopped dead because there was Nora Sweeney on her knees scrubbing the far end of the floor, and beside her, lying flat with his chin stretched out on the stone, was Koo Moore, his great amber eyes half closed, watching her work with the expression of a creature that has decided after long thought that this is where it wants to be. The morning light came in gray and thin through the tall windows. Neither of them looked up when Patrick appeared around the corner. They were simply there, in the cold corridor, in the quiet. Two separate living things occupying the same moment without any awkwardness at all. Patrick had stood there for a moment, and then he had turned around and gone the long way to deliver his message. He thought, when he was honest with himself, that it was because it was so simple. Two living things who had chosen each other, not out of need or obligation, but out of something much quieter. Recognition. The sense of having been truly seen, not for what you were supposed to be or what people expected of you, but simply for what you were. A maid with ink-stained fingers, and a calm way of moving through the world. A dog who was too large for the space he was given, and did not know how to ask for more. And a cold stone corridor in the early morning, where a young woman sat down on the floor and began to hum, and the world, for a while, became a little less frightening for both of them. Accounts gathered by the Parish Historical Society of Wexford, 1921,